Welcome to today's episode for the podcast of the initiative of the regenerative market economy. And as usual, without much ado, our guest today is Jordan Hall, but I'll let you introduce yourself with the usual first question. Jordan, who are you? What defines you? What gives you or what helps the listener to understand
Yeah.
what your perspective is during our conversation?
Well, when you presented it in that way, which to be perfectly frank is my favorite way of hearing that question thus far, which is to say, okay, arm the listener to have a sense of the lenses and the biases that are um, behind the perspective that they'll be hearing for the rest of the podcast. Um, so in my case, I mean, it's a bit of a kaleidoscope. So there's a lot of layering of distinct lenses and frankly distinct biases all the way from way back in the beginning. So if you layer it in developmentally, I come from a context that even at the very beginning at a political level was split. So my mother's side of the family are politically liberal Jewish, with as is often the case, orientation towards artisanal craftsmanship and academia. My dad's side of the family are politically conservative, Western European, with an orientation towards the military and more energy or materials based entrepreneurship. And these two perspectives were never integrated in my household. They simply existed as separate. So the political debates that are so divisive in the West these days were sort of always present as a child for me. And I think adapted a capacity to live and honor both. Like I don't have a bias towards either one in particular. Both have a naturalness and a healthiness. And I think my mature perspective is to recognize the role that each of these I guess, lineages have to play in a healthy community, and also what it looks like when they're not well integrated. Um, Layering on a few more pieces, which I think autobiographically are important. Um, in my early age, roughly 7 years old to 18, um, a lot of gamer mind. So I played all the different kinds of games. I played all kinds of team sports. I also played all the different kinds of computer games and console games and board games and role playing games. So a richly trained mind, which learned how to identify the essences of games and to learn how to game games and to even have a sense of aesthetics around the quality of game design. I was also an early adopter of computation, just by luck. So as a person I'm 52, so very much a Gen Xer, but again, by the age of 8, I was using computers and I was at the forefront of most of the technical shifts that have happened. So one of the early adopters of modems, for example, one of the early adopters of networks, private networks, and then internetworks. And as my career developed in that milieu, I continued to be on the early adopter stage of all the different technical developments. However, at the same time, in keeping with the thematic, I also have a pretty sizable anti-technology or even Luddite sensibility. And so I enjoy a monastic mountain or going into the woods and just living with my hands at least as much as I enjoy playing a massively multiplayer online role-playing game. In fact, I would say more, but in a different tone. Um, as I went through the arc of life, I did a degree in philosophy, specializing in continental philosophy, both German and French, but with an underlying interest in things like American pragmatism and Marshall McLuhan's media theory. A law degree at Harvard Law School, where I was lucky enough to run into Larry Lessig when he was really, I'd say, at the peak of his powers. and studied cyber law at the foot of the master. Left all of those and went into tech entrepreneurship, started several companies, or was involved in the starting of several companies. One was mp3.com. So that places me right at the very end of the dot-com bubble. And then two more, the most significant of which for me was a company called DivX, which played a role in what we're doing right now, being able to do podcasts and video conferencing and things like that. During the dark age after the bubble burst in September 11th, right before the big global financial crisis. Shelved that in 2007. Continued to play in that space through the angel investing universe. And gosh, I've made probably hundreds of angel investments. So I have some familiarity with that area. Got deeply involved in crypto at the very beginning. So I was reading the white paper on Michelle Bowen's P2P network before it was even on bitcoin.org, and participated, mined in the early days and things like that. Was involved in the Ethereum, what would they call it? The initial token sale, the minting. Spent time playing in the lands of the rich and famous, both in the political level at places like the Aspen Institute, the social level, like going to Necker Island with Richard Branson and crew on several occasions, and in the more sort of academic world at the Santa Fe Institute. And that bridge led me into the phase that is sometimes known as the game B phase, where I personally began to have an increasing awareness of the nature of civilization, the moment that we happen to be in now as a new kind of global civilization. The premise, which I now am operating under 100%, that our civilization, like all, is coming to an end, and coming to an end rather soon. And also that the kind of thing that we've known as civilization itself might be coming to an end. So kind of an order of magnitude higher. And that's been about a 10-year arc that has involved a substantial amount of personal research, personal development. I should go into that in a moment, I suppose. And collaboration with a really diverse range of people from a very large number of different backgrounds, sensibilities, ranging from indigenous people to the various world religions, and about 5 or 6 different paradigms in the secular world. And on that journey, continuing to have a sense that something around mindset or way of thinking, not just content of thought, but mode of thinking, is part and parcel to this transition. And so, hammering away, I suppose, alchemically and from a practitioner perspective, at my own psychology and my mind and my emotional landscape and my capacity, as some might say, consciousness, has also been a part of that theme coming up to the very tail end. Oftentimes when people ask me the question, for example, of what do I do? The answer is that I'm a husband and a father, which is probably the easiest way to get the snapshot of where my bias is ground out.
So what I'm gathering from this is you, from a very early age, have evolved the capacity to hold polar opposites and maybe even integrate them. And you've continued and continuously try to expand the envelope of your perspective on the world into multiple dimensions, which you opened as being kaleidoscopic,
Yeah.
having many, many aspects. I sense a stronger proclivity towards technology than towards the art in what you just described.
Mm-hmm.
Although I also have heard you talk about the importance of art and the more ephemeral parts of the world. Maybe a good set of questions to um, explore in that area a little bit more is what fills you with love
Mm.
and what are you afraid of?
Hmm. A way of saying it, I suppose, it might be something like the wholesome ordinary fills me with love. Um, say the observing an old couple sitting on a park bench watching the lake fills me with love. Listening to the sound of my wife and daughter chatting over just ever so like just right over there. Um, simple things, sunsets. Um, Friendship, conviviality, ordinary wholesomeness. I would say is the
Beautiful.
deepest tone. Yeah, and then what am I afraid of? Hmm. I'm afraid of my own weakness. I'm afraid of my sinful nature, as the as those who talk about those kinds of things, which for me often comes to just a variety of personality characteristics that are pretty baked deep. While how do you say like I have been able to scaffold them or even smooth them over time. But nonetheless, for example, anger is a deep characteristic of my nature. And I endeavor to bring it to service of love, but
Mhm.
sometimes it has its own intents. And so I'm afraid mostly breaking the things I care about the most by virtue of my own weaknesses.
Wow, beautiful, intense. I feel pretty complete in having a picture of where Jordan is coming from. Um, let's dive into a first question. So at the IRM, the Initiative for the Regenerative Market Economy, we like looking at our activity through the lens of Wohlstand, which is a German term for wealth. But and I know in the English language it's wealth encompasses more than just financial capital, but in the German it more actively encompasses other dimensions of well-being,
Mm-hmm.
being in social coherence with others, etc.
Yeah.
But we are on the search for what a new definition of Wohlstand might be, because in the political public discourse in Germany, at least, it's equivocated with money, and we all know that's
Ah.
nonsense. But we want to explore perspectives into what new Wohlstand might mean. So I'm really curious to hear what does that mean for you?
Mm. Mm. And teasing this apart feels like maybe the right way to go. So what I noticed is that when you pointed out the specific collapsing it to money, and to be very clear, collapsing it to fungible integer money, um, maybe as a starting point, because that is of its essence the notion of a simulacrum of rich complexity. So what we want is we want to have an intimate relationship with lived, rich complexity.
Mhm.
And that intimacy is interpenetrating, right? A level of subtlety and a level of interiority and exteriority. So we want to be connected to a whole. When we say, what was the word? Wohlst,
Wohlstand.
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 Wohlstand. Um, something like wholeness, wholesomeness, holiness. Yeah. I've often played with the phrase holy, 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 to say that this means healing, wholesomeness, and connection to the whole.
Yes.
Um, and the point I would make, maybe to bring it into looking into the view, is way back, like back in the day, back in the indigenous times, we had something like that, in the sense that we really, really had an extraordinarily intimate and nuanced, subtle relationship with the actual complexity of the world in which we lived, which had a deeply, one might say, even unconscious, an unconsidered sense of connectedness to that whole. And this manifests itself in the notion that I've heard many times, that if you show a Westerner a picture of a person walking through the forest, they say, "Oh, that's a picture of a person walking through the forest." Whereas an indigenous person says, "Oh, it's a forest. Oh, yeah, there's a person in there." So the foregrounding of the context, the foregrounding of the complex, and then the noticing of the particular, but as already subsidiary. Um, so in some sense, a return to that, but not in all senses. This next move, the move that we've been living in, is the move of the virtual, the move of the simulation, which is not a negative term. Um, Simulacrum is more in the direction of a negative term, or we could even say the move of the digital, right? The ability to
Mhm.
construct something that can morph itself, is polymorphic in the sense that it can take the shape of anything. This is money, for example, or the digital. Um, and in many ways can become so fine-grained a mapping to the real lived complexity of the thing that it's simulating that is indistinguishable. Like, for example, the view that I'm looking at in my camera. It's not really
Mhm.
you, but if it has a fine enough pixel and it refreshes at a high enough rate, my eyes are tricked into believing that I'm looking at a real thing, not a flat screen that has phosphors that are flickering rapidly, which is pretty much the right metaphor. Money is the same kind of thing as that, right? Money is the same kind of thing as I think I'm looking at real live field of value. Well, I'm not. I'm actually looking at a simulation of that, but it can flicker rapidly enough and is fine grained enough that it's effectively indistinguishable um, in the context of a particular purpose.
Mhm.
So the notion there is that once I subordinate the complex reality that I'm living in to some sort of purpose, I can then foreground the aspects of that complex reality that I care about, that I'm foregrounding that are relevant to the purpose, and background, even to the point of throwing away entirely the part that I don't care about as much. For me, the metaphor that pops into my head is what happens when we engage in creating an MP3 audio compression. And I take an analog wave and I foreground, or in this case, capture and keep the aspects of it that we propose that the ear can notice, and then encode that in a digital form, throwing away some amount of that information, by hypothesis, some amount that doesn't matter, that the ear, quote unquote, can't hear. Um, but of course, we know that the sensitivity to the microcosmic is an intrinsic characteristic of complex environments. Um, I've been looking at Mike Levin's work on intelligence, for example, and the kind of the fractal chaining up of whatever it is that allows my will to have the macro effect of moving my lips and making words come out of my mouth. Um, the reality is composed of those sorts of things. And so the failure condition of this second phase, this great digital phase, this great simulation phase, the phase of money, is inherent in that gap. What happens when you throw away? What happens when you construct your reality on the basis of purposes and the fragilities that are built into systems that are constructed in that way? So then we move to this third. It has something to do with a return to an intimacy of connectedness to a whole, but now at a higher tone, a more wholesome connection, perhaps a more conscious connection, um, perhaps one that integrates a lot of those capacities that we developed in this long arc of technology. I would say quite likely one that has that, and scaffolds the power of, let's say, the machine or the intellect, intelligence, algorithmic intelligence, to be precise, um, at a level that humans were really never capable of, never really should have been endeavoring to be capable of, but always subordinated and never throwing away that intimacy, that last piece, that element of the whole, the connected whole, the continuous. Which this means that the end result is stewardship, right? An ability to not only have um, well-being in its most holistic sense, but to actually have responsibility for stewarding the whole being of the world in which we live. And so simultaneously being, moving, I guess the metaphor of human development, moving from being the child well nurtured
Mm-hmm.
to being the parent well nurturing, but
Mm-hmm.
also noticing how it is necessary as a parent to be nurtured by the nurturing of the child and the child itself, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, if I understand you correctly, in essence, you're saying we have a longing for mm, embracing the complex, being part of the complexity of life. We've abstracted that away, but to a sufficient level that we can hardly notice that we've abstracted away with technologies like money, but also others. And you're saying that there's a possibility that we could start sending these artificial additional abstraction layers of abstraction to an extent where we can re-embrace the complex, but from a higher level of understanding, from a more solid understanding than um, 60,000 years of developing hunches in a way.
Yes.
Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I think that is fair, and I'm mindful of how do I say, honoring the wisdom of those folks 50,000 years ago. Um, it's plausible that we may never return to that depth of wisdom, and that's there's an intimacy that just is not where we are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and at the same time, I do have a sense to which I'm only lightly attached that we haven't wasted the last 10,000 years. That there's something we have developed something. We have developed a knowledge. I'll give you an example. Barring levels of capacity in the realm that I suppose would be called the supernatural that I don't really have a handle on. Um, in the 50,000 years ago, the humans on the Earth were highly susceptible to, for example, an asteroid striking the Earth. Uh, where we are now as well, but at least in principle, we could actually become capable of noticing it well in advance and perhaps rallying a way to respond to it by technical means. Um, I'm undecided on this last piece. Like I don't really fully understand the richness and frankly reality. Reality is complex. Like I don't want to come with a pre-assumed notion that a um, how would you say it, reductionist materialist sensibility is either complete or absurd. And I think there's something to it that brings a value, and there's a radical overvaluing of it that's present in fading, but was certainly present in our world until recently. And I think back to the sort of the thematic, both perspectives are true, and it's interesting to see how we play with both.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. I didn't mean to somehow devalue the 60,000 years of songline or anything in that comment. I just wanted to contrast it. And I think for that, as you just said, applies the same as for our lens into the world, which is it can either be um, completely absurd or or the exact opposite, right? Completely truthful uh, and integrating wholesome.
Yeah.
So but understanding that about the complexity across time, I think, um, is also something I'm hearing in your thoughts about Wohlstand, which is there are long arcs of time that are happening, and yes, there are some aspects of something new that is being learned, but ultimately, as parts of nature, as part of nature, we already have pretty good understanding of what it means to be in Wohlstand, wealthy. Um, and sometimes we lose a little bit track of that because we add abstractions, but sometimes these abstractions then help us add new layers to the wholesome perspective.
Yeah, for some reason it feels it just came to me that I would say very like quite convinced that I have substantially more wealth now than I had, say, 15 years ago. And I have substantially less money now than I had 15 years ago, about an order of magnitude less. But I have a much higher level of it, just in my interior, myself, much higher level of maturity, much higher level of wisdom, much higher capacity to appreciate the world that I live in all of its different aspects, but negative and positive. And therefore, as a consequence, I also have both a capacity and in some sense, a reality of richer, more intimate, and more meaningful relationships. And that's just a very first person way of pointing to it. And I would definitely make that trade every time. It's a good trade.
The way I think about that exact trait is through the lens of the eight forms of capital and transforming financial capital into uh, intellectual, experiential, cultural, social, etc., spiritual forms of capital that ends in a balancing that is appropriate to what I perceive as a good state, a good life, or I and the collective of humans I'm part of consider to be a good life. So that this balance is our ultimate measure of success, and that then defines our Wohlstand.
Yeah, yeah.
But
And
that, yeah,
notice the
right.
implication there of that notion of a whole, like a connection, you and, yeah. There's no real way of even thinking about it or measuring it in mm, a proper way that cuts parts apart. There's a I can think about myself, but I can't really actually think about myself properly without immediately implicating the entire network of relationships in some sense that I am.
Yes, I find it very useful to remind myself of that every time I'm proud of something.
Nice.
Because effectively, nothing I've ever achieved, I achieved without the help of others.
Hmm.
So pride cannot exist from the perspective of the individual. At best, it can exist from the perspective of the or a collective of individuals. Um, but even then, uh, it can't really. It can just be gratitude towards the environment and circumstances that allowed you to achieve whatever you achieved. Moving on from that big, complex notion of Wohlstand and mapping that onto uh, what we just started to explore, which is the interconnectedness, the relationship between people, which turns into an economy by means of exchange of goods and services and doing things together, deciding. Um, and for me, it's very obvious that the current um, instantiation of this is not really conducive to the kind of Wohlstand you were describing. Which begs the question, what would you say could be a version of an economy that actually creates that kind of Wohlstand in the world for everyone?
Well, a way that I've been thinking about it recently is well, I want to make a distinction between freedom and minimum viable slavery. Um, and I think that this is a very important distinction because I think we've gotten quite confused. I would say that what's happened over the past several thousand years is we have moved into ephemeralization of tyranny. We are clearly not slaves in the Bronze Age sense. We're clearly not slaves in the Roman Age sense. We're clearly not peons or serfs in the medieval sense. Right? Every step and stage has been a move of the amelioration of the onerousness and, in some sense, the obviousness of our subordination to constraint and power over and fear. But we haven't actually escaped from it at the essential level. It's become more subtle and more nuanced. But in the global marketplace, everyone is ultimately, at the end of the day, still fundamentally spiritually a slave.
Mm-hmm.
What I mean is this: it's kind of the two edges of it. The one edge is well, if your money suddenly disappeared, you would be without any recourse. You'd not be able to live. You would be homeless. You would be begging on the street. That movie Trading Places. Remember where the kind of the wealthy character had all of his credit cards deleted and his bank accounts deleted and his identity deleted, and all of his sort of not real relationship friends suddenly rebuked him and denied him, and he was actually reduced to being living on the streets. Um, that fear beats at the heart of the system that we live in. Right? It's a driver. It is the stick. And if you don't think you feel it, you probably should pay more attention. Um, Even if it's just in the small, like we all feel it as you stack up, right? The classic feeling of the billionaire who's got $1 billion and the fear they have of not being worth $1 billion, but being worth only 700 million, right? It's at the heart. And then the other side of that same heart is the addiction, right? The reverse, the way that you try to address that fear at the heart is you stuff it with heaps of stuff that tries to get you further and further away from that. If I have a
Mm-hmm.
big enough stack, but of course, what happens is I get addicted to the heap. I'm no longer even connected. I'm further away from connectedness than I was even in a previous period. Um, so actually dealing with that, actually becoming free, actually living as truly free humans, um, not having jobs, but having vocations, having a felt sense of the empowerment of taking on a responsibility and noticing that there may be something towards which you are actually called, like seeking constraint that is a natural constraint of your thrownness in the world, right? Not seeking to be unconstrained, which is what happens when you're a rebel slave still wearing the kind of the golden manacles. Um, but actually living as a free human, which means to seek your proper constraints. That's a very different world. And I would say, by the way, that this came to me analytically thinking about, well, how do we simply address the reality that we're about to reach the end of employment, qua employment, the bleeding edge of all the different technical advancements. We can wave our hands at the notion that every time in the past that we've made a significant technical advancement that's unemployed or destroyed whole industries, that we've been able to repurpose humans into those new places.
Mm-hmm.
I would say, by the way, at tremendous cost. Let's not even vaguely paper over that. Right? The cost to humans and to families and to culture and to meaning and to life was significant. Um, but also there was a pace. It takes quite a while, generations, to migrate um, small farmers to being people working in a factory. This is not a thing that happens, particularly if you're 50 or 60. We basically sort of turn a blind eye to the 50 and 60-year-olds who just sort of had their lives terminated or their livelihoods terminated. Well, but the 14-year-olds were able to become factory workers eventually. But the world we're moving into is one where the rate of change and the pace and the magnitude and the capacity of the machine is just not the sort of thing that we've dealt with in the past. And the likelihood that endeavoring to train humans to become whatever this new opportunity is, to me at least, is a more of an excuse than anything else. It's being used to
Okay.
rationalize. But that's okay. But actually, oddly enough, I wrote about this, maybe 10 years ago. It was an essay called The Coming Great Transition. And the point was that if you're fundamentally operating in a scarcity mindset, everyone else ultimately is a threat at the base. They're one who's to take away your rivalrous stuff. You might tacitly agree, and as long as we're living in plenty, we can get along. But you're always, whoa! If that plenty goes away, I need to make sure I got mine. That's the key. And so, therefore, of course, things like no longer being able to employ everybody is a race of I want to stay employed. Let's make sure that bad thing happens to somebody, not me. But if you're operating in the sense of an abundance mindset, it's almost exactly the opposite. Other human beings are, in fact, natural collaborators. They're the potential for collaboration. The notion that you might go without is so far away from your consciousness that it's not a primary consideration, right? You're orienting your time around how do I configure my time and space to have the most beautiful collaborations on a continuing basis, and recognize, one might say by faith, that produces such a flow of plenty. And by the way, that our real needs are in fact so little, that it flips. Right? It is in fact a real different way of being.
So you're basing your model on freedom, which is based in abundance. And that, of course, begs the question, where does that abundance come from?
Mm-hmm.
Can we go there a little? And
Absolutely. So first, I want to sort of define terms a little bit. I threw some things out earlier, but you point at the right place. Let's be precise. There's a distinction in kind between scarcity and abundance, not a distinction in quantity. On the quantity continuum, you have something like privation and plenty. And in the category of plenty, we could even keep going towards too much. Here's where I have a finite set of needs, and I'm not meeting them, or I'm meeting them, and then I'm exceeding them. Abundance is on a different dimension. It's not on that dimension. They relate to each other, but they're not the same one. Abundance has to do with how you are in relationship to possibility, not in relationship to actuality. Right? It's a disposition. Abundance is a disposition, not a state of quantitative affairs. You can have an abundance mindset, even if you're living in a life of relative scarcity. This is quite, for example, whole practices, like whole monastic practices are built around the basis of live in what is in fact actual live poverty, but orient your heart towards abundance. So that's a real possibility. Right? The amount of physical material can be relatively small if the heart is oriented towards abundance. Right? So that's the distinction. Now, what happens is, and this is sort of the best news, is that when our hearts are oriented towards abundance, this happens to be the location that affords the highest capacity for generative collaboration. And as we've discovered over the eras and the aeons, generative collaboration is the thing that most successfully produces plenty.
Mm-hmm.
So it's when we are grounded, our hearts are in abundance, we then are able to enter more and more into generative collaboration, and therefore are more and more easily, and the word easy is critical, more reliably, more flexibly, more adaptively able to achieve a state of plenty. So you can see, if you model this, you've got multiple levels of flexibility. If I'm grounded in abundance and I'm in collaborative relationship, I actually can have a pretty sizable flux in the state of my material conditions while still staying in abundance.
Mm-hmm.
And I have the ability to actually have this adaptive capacity, which is unlocked by collaborative capacity, that allows me to hold the state of plenty with a much higher level of, again, ease and reliability. Okay.
And what might there be conditions in which that increased capacity to produce plenty might flip over in too much again? Um, or how do you hold as a collective the
Mhm.
space of being in abundance without overshooting beyond plenty?
Well, what I would say is something like, if we're grounded in scarcity at the most basic level, then there's a strong tendency to moving from plenty to too muchness. If we're grounded in abundance, then it's almost an accident. When we, oh, whoops, we accidentally created too much. And it's a problem to be addressed.
Mhm.
It's perceived properly as being something that actually moves us out of wealth. Oh, whoops, we made too much, which means, for example, that we're probably taking away from another place that needs it. So it moves
Mm.
back into a space of taking proper care. So, yes, of course, we are finite and limited and sinful creatures. And so we will be making errors. But if you're grounded in abundance, the the experience of too muchness would be perceived very similar to the experience of an unwanted too littleness, which is to
Mhm.
say, oh, okay, something to be responded to, and let us do so.
Okay. I've mm, I have no problem seeing this at a sub Dunbar scale. So
Mm, mm,
on the Dunbar, uh, up to 4,000 maybe. Um, but I have some trouble seeing how this cascades across 8 billion people, um, and across time, so space and time and high volumes of people, which, to be fair, the indigenous wisdom keepers do not know how to deal with because they didn't have that kind of situation.
mhm.
So how do we integrate that into a coherent model of the whole?
Well, first caveat is well, maybe three steps. One is we have to make some assumptions about how reality works.
Hmm.
What variations on the many human stories of the nature of reality are we going to choose from our toolkit of how we're going to think about this design problem? Um, Second, we then have to say, okay, within the constraints of the design toolkit that we've identified, how might we go about solving it? And then third, and I think maybe the third is the point that I'd like to put my thumb on the most, a certain sense of optimistic humility, which is that we're rather stupid right now, far stupider than we could easily be if we simply stopped getting in our own way. And we have no real idea of how less stupid we could become over time, and how less foolish we could become over time. And so we should be aware of that fact as well. Right? So one is saying, okay, we have an inheritance of a variety of different models of how reality works. How are we going to be thoughtful about selecting from that? Second, okay, now that we've selected, how do we do things? But then third, could think about this as being on a continuum or a vector, which is to say, yeah, fair enough. I don't know how to solve that problem either. Nothing about it strikes me as being the kind of thing that is absolutely categorically insoluble. And even if it did, I'm going to take a principle of humility that maybe it's because of my own limitations of creativity or wisdom. This is why it feels that way, as opposed to being able to prove that it can't be solved. So, given all that, um, I'll choose to accept, um, I'd say, a relatively secular, 21st century, relatively scientific set of paradigms as my design toolkit. Um, Not obligatory, but I'll use that. And so in that case, what I would start thinking about is, how do we put this AI thing to proper use? You know, how do we create a scaffolding or a skeleton for Homo sapiens that allows us to leverage this superpowered algorithmic intelligence to solve the problem that we're looking at? Right? Not to answer the questions, but to allow us to know when we need to answer the questions, right? Help us be aware of the states that we find ourselves in, that the choices that we're making and the consequences of our choices in a way that our minds and our human style collective intelligences thus far cannot achieve. Right? So this is a human machine hybrid may have precisely the kinds of capacities that we're looking for. I'll give you an example. What I called it, I thought of a unit of account, which is to say, I'm playing with the terms of definitions of money, a kind of AI system that I called Caesar, so we could render unto Caesar. If it's an acronym, it's even better. That has its characteristic. And by the way, this is all quite doable, like an appropriate project in the order of $1 billion, like well within the zone of what could be done. It has an awareness of the economy. Think of it as a really, really sophisticated supply management logistics system that has an ontological, when I say ontological, I mean this in the computer sense, like a database, with a ontological element for all of the distinct patterns that the economy produces, all of the ground elements that make those patterns are made up of, which means that obviously it grounds out in nature. So the atomic elements and all the different aspects of nature, all of the different transformative processes that we use, all the consequences of those transformative processes, and then is ultimately a state machine. So it can actually simply map what are the patterns, where are they, what is the ambient actual energy use of Homo sapiens in the world right now, what are its externalities, and what are its inputs, to a greater or lesser degree of precision and fidelity. Right? What we can do right now will get us, I don't know, 80, 85% of the way there, which is a hell of a lot better than we are now. And then we can continue to get better and better and better. I would presume in something like 80-20 rule cycles and relatively quickly, which is to say, get really quite good at that in not too long, like say in an order of a decade. Now, such a machine, such a system could then very easily allow us to know the consequences of our choices. I'll back up one piece. Interestingly enough, I mapped this to German because the professor I had at Harvard was German. And I remember talking with him. I just had a really interesting idea, and I sat down with him. He actually invited me to do a whole project with him on this idea. And I ended up not doing it because it seemed like a lot of work, and I'm very lazy. But the notion was that one of the implications of global markets, but even markets in general, is a breakdown of our ethical capacity due to epistemological and agentic overload. So I can't actually know what the consequences of my buying choices are. The chain of causality is so long and so diffuse and over such a large geographic range that we try really hard to sort of make ethical choices when we buy things, but we can't. And therefore, we find ourselves becoming as if sociopaths because we have to make choices. We have to buy things. We have to feed ourselves and clothe ourselves. We can't really own the consequences of our choices, so we have to dull ourselves to those choices. But Caesar, as I'm describing it, in principle could. Right? It could actually, with very high degree of fidelity, and by the way, without any of the limitations of bureaucracy, meaning it has no interests of its own. Right? It just is a machine. It just does input and output. The designers of Caesar, we need to be careful about that, but the machine itself can be audited, and it will definitely do what it does. And this is not like the accounting office or the whatever bureaucracy, which will inevitably become captured by its own internal interests and external parties. And so that reconnection of my ability to know the consequences of my actions, where I could go to Caesar and say, well, here's my values. Here's the values that I'd like to live by. Can you provide me with some inputs on how my choices are actually violating my values or reinforcing my values? And this is a different milieu than we're used to. So that's like a case study of an example of how we might be able to scaffold this kind of a construct at a level of scale that is planetary in nature and includes the whole of humanity. And interestingly, in this case, is a valorous relationship with technology. It actually finally puts technology at the left hand of humanity and puts it in a really solid place of high quality service, which then allows us to play our proper role of stewardship.
Before you went into the implementation of Caesar, you said something not uh, very explicitly. Maybe I got you wrong, but it sounded like this AI, instead of answering, could be asking asking questions. So
Oh
it
yes.
potentially could be Socrates more than Caesar. Um,
I'm laughing because there is actually a project that I'm involved in that is specifically called Project Socrates, attempting
okay.
to work on wise or AW, right, artificial wisdom or wise AI. And I would say offering designs, asking questions, like asking, helping us become more intimate in our own understanding, and then giving us feedback on what are plausible consequences of our choices. I think all three of these are valid. Maybe Socrates and Caesar are both out there interacting with each other.
Now maybe Socrates is just one interface layer on top of of Caesar, right?
Yeah.
Um, okay.
This is the this is a remember the beginning, making some design constraints around what our design toolkit is, that then produces this set of possibilities.
Okay. So to recap that last part, you're essentially saying there's a whole stack of options, and you just choose to pick from one that's close to you, which um, tends to be science and technology. But a similar answer to solving um, scaling out or fractal interdependence across large quantities of humans across the planet could be done in other ways.
Indeed.
Um, and you trust that somehow we can solve this.
Yeah,
From
let me give a different example, which I know that we both I read your your recent update. Um, I think we both have concluded there's a certain, let's say, geometry to how humans are how humans live, which is quite likely part of this transitionary future. Um, so here we're talking about Dunbar scale and probably holonic layers of different levels of Dunbar scale, and when I say Dunbar scale, just to make it clear, I'm by implication am also bringing in a deep relationship with place. Um, that your lived environment is also part of your field of relationality as well as the humans. And it's important, I think, conceptually to be conscious of that because we've become so alienated from place in our diaspora, in our wanderings. Um, and if I reflect on what happens to humans when their needs are being met in a very humane way, and they actually have all of the relationships they could really have as humans at the Dunbar level, and they have a deeply steward a whole relationship where they're being held by the place and they're holding that place. Um, for most humans, for the vast majority of humans, their zone of care is satisfied. They don't
Mhm,
need to worry about what's going on far away, particularly if they have very high confidence what's going on far away is relatively well taken care of and is unlikely to be a threat. Right? So that's very interesting how small that squeezes the space of what we need to be concerned with. And if you think about it, the problematic of humanity sort of post upper Paleolithic transition went through a threat problem and has only recently entered into a care problem. So, of course, for the longest period of time, actually, many people lived quite nice lives, relatively speaking. They had wealth in the sense of they had good relationships, they had a beautiful place they lived in that they could care for. But then something from the outside would come in and disrupt that. That outside might be a Mongol invasion, it might be a
mhm,
disease,
mhm,
um, it might be a natural change, like drought, for example. But within their local environment, people could find relatively quality, stable equilibrium. So if we're thinking about it that way, if we're just able to make sure that we're thinking about these larger perturbations that are outside of the Dunbar scale and have those be things that we construct novel institutional structures, perhaps scaffolded with things like Caesar and Socrates, but only living at that level, then that reduces the scope of what your attention has to worry about. And if there's a sense, if it works, if we feel good about that, and we do, by the way, in cities, for example, we dealt with the problem of fire relatively well. For a long period of time, fire was a real problem in urban environments. And it's not so much of a problem anymore. I remember even as a kid having a mental model that fire could happen. Like people would smoke in bed and he would set fire. Fires seem to be a real thing. Nowadays, it's not that common. We've kind of dealt with that. So imagine that at a planetary scale. Now, of course, more recently, and this is the beautiful inverse of that, is the notion that as we extend our field of care, if an earthquake happens in Turkey and I happen to live in North Carolina, how do I provide care? I have a feeling of wanting to. But again, if you can imagine where the as long as care is being taken, and funny, we can actually do this at micro level. I'm watching a group of boys and girls, but mostly boys, play soccer. And somebody gets hit in some way and he kind of falls to the ground holding his knee. So my attention goes, I watch. But I see there's a gathering and I'm watching it and I notice that it's taking care of itself, so my care doesn't have to stand into it, right? Some way of actually being able to have a really fluid sense of as long as care is being taken, as long as the local environment can expand its sphere of need to call on resources to take care of itself adequate to the scope of what it's dealing with, then allowing the local environment to take care of itself, then I don't need to worry about that. That's not my responsibility. So those two sides, right? The field of care over here and the field of
Mm-hmm.
threat over here that is outside of the zone of my Dunbar scale. If that's all we're really worried about, that's a different problem.
So we could, effectively, you're saying we could solve this at some Dunbar scale level. We might even be able to go beyond Dunbar by what I would call be context dependent, in being various context dependent Dunbar circles.
Mm-hmm.
So um, there might be, for some reason, some of your contexts might be connected with Hawaii. And if there's something happening on Hawaii, you're immediately connected.
Mm-hmm.
And you can, through that connection, observe whether care is taken or not and whether your response is required or not.
Yep.
Which in the detached mode where something happens in some other part of the world and you don't have an extension of yourself into that part of the world through being part of a Dunbar context, you will not know. Maybe not even of it, but also not know whether care is being taken. And ultimately, that then requires you to trust that sufficient care is being taken at all times because
Yes.
there is a sufficient number of people around that are able to take care,
Yep.
which then ultimately begs the question, what levels of disaster
Hmm.
require what radiuses of care?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
And I would argue that there is a limited set of disasters that require large radiuses of care. Most things that happen can sufficiently be taken care of by very low Dunbar scale numbers, 150 and below, I'd say.
Yes. Agreed. Absolutely. Particularly if we can create bespoke meshes, as you say.
Mm-hmm.
As if I can pull from all over the world people who are prepared, who already come in with the right requisite capacity, and bring them
Mm-hmm.
together to deal with a particular issue on a bespoke basis, and then allow them to return. So let me multiply this a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Much of the trouble we deal with is a consequence of the tools that we've built to deal with things.
Mm-hmm.
Um, technocracy and the technocratic mindset and technocrats
Hmm.
um, are like 80% of the problem. I think it's important to foreground that. Um, we've built institutions that have a cybernetic power capacity um, and have a tremendous cybernetic power capacity, and they can address problems, but they're also extremely capturable.
Hmm.
And they have the mental image I have is of that. Sorry, this is another piece I didn't mention. A super saturation of media during my developmental years. Um, that exoskeleton that Ripley used during Aliens. Um, our cybernetic, our technocratic institutions stomp about in this subtle world that we live in.
Hmm.
The
Okay.
interventions are coarse grained and create ripples all over the place.
Hmm.
So they're highly capturable, inevitably must be captured because whoever's in charge of them has so much outsized leverage. Their own internal capacity to avoid capture is very weak in relationship with the advantage of capturing them. So the logic's pretty straightforward. And even if they're not captured, they're too coarse grained to truly be effective in the world that we're operating in. What you're
Hmm.
pointing out is that if we could actually create highly intimate, very bespoke, with a very subsidiarity sensibility, like pinpoint accuracy, um, and that nuance, right? I spent at least 7 or 8 years working with people who had spent time dealing with the problem of NGOs and the problem of trying to help, and how these sort
Hmm.
of hammers of help that we deliver to people almost always create more trouble than the help that we
Hmm.
provide, in instantaneously and certainly over time. But it's not impossible to go in and
Hmm.
actually empower local people who know the complex subtlety of the environment that they're in and can recognize that any given solution is usually going to be multivariate and, in fact, will morph over time as as the environment you're in changes over time. Okay,
Hmm.
yeah, fair enough. Um, this is just that notion of fluidity and intimate relationship. And if we're really connected with maybe make a point of it. Complexity, we oftentimes get scared by the notion of complexity, but I think we shouldn't.
Hmm.
We're naturally quite good at coming into a fluid mastery of complexity. Juggling is a highly complex thing. If you really think about what's going on in your eyes and your hands and your bodies and your muscles, and if you've ever begun to juggle, it's overwhelming. But then people can learn how to juggle. Language and communication is a very complex things, but by the time a child is 2 or 3, they're beginning to get good at it. By the time they're 5 or 7, they've mastered it. Um, what we get into trouble with is when we overlay these simulacrums of complexity and create extremely complicated systems that
Hmm.
simulate complexity. Now that's trouble. That's real trouble. It's overwhelming. It's hard. It breaks. We constantly have to manage it. And we're not naturally good at it. Right? We're using the wrong faculty. So the point would be something like, can we reorientate ourselves in fluid complexity? Can we recognize that that's actually part of our gift as Homo sapiens, and these little holons that I think you were describing, where a
Hmm. Yeah.
certain thing that needs care emerges, and an appropriately fluidly complex collective intelligence, but perhaps cybernetic human machine collective intelligence is birthed into it, really just to support whatever's going on in the local environment, so that, by the way, whatever trouble emerged becomes a learning experience. Right? Whenever trouble emerges, that's a great place to learn, right, and to develop more capacity and to grow. Um, Again, we can do that. We already know how to do that. We're just most of the capacity to do that is jammed by the technocratic institutions that have taken the responsibility that they can't actually properly deliver on. So that's what I'm saying. Like, most of the trouble is not the hard problem. Most of the trouble is that we're in our own way.
And all of these rest in freedom, love, and trust, effectively, to be able
Yes,
to do them.
that's right.
Um, and before we get to a closing, I'd love to explore um, a little bit into pathways, because now we've been exploring the vague outlines of a desirable end state. But what kind of pathways are you hopeful about
Yeah.
towards that?
So first, I want to just model what I'll call maybe the Chronos pathway and the Kairos pathway, because both will be part of this journey. The Chronos pathway is something like the linear, the thing that we can plan on, um, the stuff that we're doing in the meantime. And the Kairos pathway is frankly the place where we're going to be making most of our headway, but we can't plan on it, and it's going to be choppy, or it'll be scary. It'll be a crisis. Um, and there's two reasons for that. One is it's going to take crisis. In fact, we might even notice that the very nature of the term crisis has to do with the going away of. Right? So it's going to take crisis to liberate us or to free us from the constraints of the legacy institutions that are so much of the trouble. Consciously, like in our minds, to free us of the mindset of assuming that old ways are, and by old ways, I mean like 20-year-old ways, not 10,000-year-old ways, that old ways are obligatory or unconscious. Or in fact, to just recognize, to demoralize institutions and say, hey, can we please stop just banging ourselves in the toe with this hammer? Can we just put the hammer aside and recognize there may be other ways of dealing with this? And then the Chronos, right? The Chronos is, hey, here are principles and here are practices and here are heuristics that allow us to orient our day-to-day choices so that we're getting healthier and stronger as we go forward on a continuing basis. So when the crisis comes, we are equal to it and we can meet it properly. As an example, I happened to be in a really beautiful spot in the earliest stages of COVID. My sort of global network gave me a heads up that something was likely, something very important to watch was happening in China in November of 2019. So I was already sort of fully tuned up and eyes on. And by February of 2020, was sort of fully immersed and had opened up all kinds of networks and connections, and was watching things unfold all over the place. And what I can say is this: we almost got there. We almost broke through. These bottoms up, spontaneous development of new capacities, which are ambient in the environment, super saturated in the environment, began to connect up. Like I was watching the human formation of DNA from ambient molecules happen, and it was moving so fast, and it was beautiful. People were doing the human thing. It was gorgeous. It was noble. Right? Humans were engaging in noble sacrifice to do meaningful, purposeful things to help each other, for real, in a big way, and not, by the way, vaguely in a simulation way. And people were showing up. I mean, I had conversations with people where I said, hey, here's a project I'm working on. Here's something we're doing. And on a phone call with somebody I just met, like, here's $100 million project that I'm stewarding. You can use it for free forever in purpose, in service of what you're doing, right? Just drop it in. We had people leaving Tesla and Palantir. And this is a story I can't tell you, but a very powerful company and an individual in that company said to his company, I quit tomorrow if you don't let me bring our technology in service of this project. And they capitulated because he was very important. So good stuff was happening. And the point is that these moments of crisis actually generate this possibility of us actually doing just a normal human thing and remembering what it means to be actual humans living in these beautiful relationships and being able to reconnect with meaningfulness and what it feels like. It's such a powerful, like the advantage of having been removed of the sweetness of meaningfulness for generations is that even a little bit of it is like a spring in the desert. Okay, so that's this pulse. The crises will accelerate, and that's bad, but it's also good. Right? The magnitude and pace and diversity, which is, by the way, right? All the different systems are in crisis. So the next one's not necessarily going to be in the last place we looked. It's going to be a new one. The crises will accelerate, and they'll accelerate in complexity as their systemic threads begin to break. Things that had previously been not in crisis will move into crisis. Okay. And so these Kairos moments will continue to proceed. And our challenge is to continue to become more and more capable of meeting them without dropping into fear. Or just think about the moral lesson of the COVID period was precisely that. At the very least, do not become captured by fear. Better to die than to be captured by fear. Stay in courage, stay in hope, stay in love, and good things can happen. So I guess that's the Chronos, right? The Chronos, when you're breathing in between crises, take that to heart and take advantage of the moment of relative stability. And again, it's just like, Do the things that are just naturally right. You know, rebuild your, reorient and deal with the things in your own life that you're supposed to have dealt with that you didn't. Remember COVID? Oh my gosh! Now I suddenly have to live with my family. Oh shit! And a whole bunch of interpersonal stuff that I didn't deal with, and now I'm stuck. For example, maybe preemptively deal with that. Like actually have the conversations you need to have with, or go through the personal transformation you need to go through. Move your physical body to a place that you actually want to be. Right? Just think,
Hmm.
what would happen if suddenly the experience we had in the first quarter of 2020 happened again in the last quarter of 2024? What would it look like if I planned ahead this time and was thoughtful about it? What would it mean for me to be actually able to use that as a growth opportunity as opposed to a truly harrowing experience? Do that stuff now. Like that's an example of at the individual level. At the larger collective level, what I notice is that it's like these little, like, what do you call them, groundhogs that kind of pop up and peep at each other. People popping up, they're all over the place. More and more people are kind of popping through and looking around and going, "Yeah, geez, I guess you're right. I guess the old way of doing things is super fucked, and it's kind of like mostly the problem anyway. And maybe we should try something new. And maybe that begins with me." Um, so if you just popped up, look around. In all likelihood, it'll take a little while to recenter. In all likelihood, you may have to make some real changes in your life. You may have to give up some serious addictions. We are all super saturated with serious addictions of all kinds. You may have to heal relationships. You may have to heal relationships with yourself. It's always good stuff. And that's just the chop wood carry water piece of this thing. Solid basic nutrition. If you don't know how to love, learn how to love. If you don't know how to trust, learn how to trust, which, by the way, does not mean be foolhardy. It means truly know how to trust. Um, you've got your own personal crises, your own personal chronos that will pop up. Great. Deal with them, but also take the meta look. Look how those things work in general and become more and more masterful in navigating those kinds of things. And then start connecting like we're doing. Right? We come from different universes, more or less. Like I don't think we'd kind of slightly come on each other's radar a few times over the past several years, but it didn't finally land until it landed, what, about a year ago? Um,
Yeah, something like that.
and now we're individually using our own kind of, how would you call it, singular modes, noticing that there's a lot of harmony and resonance and some beautiful difference, and beginning to figure out what's our proper collaboration look like. And from that place of abundance, we're on the same team intrinsically. There's only one team, right? There's a thing that thinks it's a team that is nihil, that is the end, right? It's death. The more quickly you come to a recognition that the inexorably self-terminating is inexorably self-terminating, and if you're on that, then you've chosen death for yourself and potentially everything else. And then there's that which is not, which is orienting towards abundance and towards this fun German word for wealth that I will never remember. Um, so we're hooking.
Wohlstand. I will send you a voice message with it, so
I
you
need
can
it
always.
written. I'm a visual learner. Write it down. If it pops up,
I'll write it.
you're on
Yeah.
the screen. That's a weird thing, right? It's a weird thing for people to get, but it actually is the case. We are actually all on the same team. There's only one real team. There's a world, and there's the team that's that world. And when you realize that, and you learn that it can be difficult to be on that team, and many people are on both teams simultaneously, and moment to moment shift back and forth, or in their hearts shift back and forth, and that's the deeper reality. Um, but if you know that in a particular moment, you and the other are able to be operating from this other place, let's say abundance for the moment, then play in that way. And in yourself, become more and more capable of playing in that way more and more skillfully and with more and more people. I mean, it sounds so stupid. It's so silly, but that is actually all there is to it.
I agree. I agree. And sometimes um, I have to learn from people like Daniel Wall to connect to being humble about it, because
Mm,
it's so much fun to unpack the complexity of the situation while we already know the answer within. And to me, somehow this binds back to your response to the questions around what fills you with love and what makes you afraid, because both these answers can be found in what you just described, in what needs to be done,
yeah.
what happens.
Hmm.
Wow, wonderful, wonderful, rich conversation.
Do we want to do the last one? The last question?
Yes, yes, we do.
I have, since you did a great job of laying out the architecture, I did my best to kind of manage my energy. So I have just enough juice for this last question, then I'm going to take a nap.
Okay, so my I always keep the hardest question for last,
Hmm.
and that is, what if you do the impossible? You imagine you have godlike powers. You have the power to instill a concept in every human's mind or soul
Hmm.
that sits there so naturally that it doesn't even get noticed. It becomes part of whatever humanness means. What would that concept be that you would like to instill in people?
I'm going to make a swing at this. This is the answer that comes to me, and I'm really interested to see how it plays out in the act of saying it and trying to explain what I mean. But the answer is God. Um, and here's the way I want to address it. Uh, I want to try this in the language of engineering, reverse engineering and forward engineering. It is my experience as I've been exploring this concept of God rather intensely, actually, for the past year, that it includes, and by the way, implicates all the things that we've been talking about in their most pristine and most complete form. So if I reverse engineer, and if I take seriously the principles we've been talking about, and I begin to isolate the content or the attractor or the field of principles that is the embodiment of those, that thing, that's God. But what it notices is that it has this characteristic of, let's say, personhood, this characteristic of wholeness, meaning that it actually allows us to integrate all the distinct principles in a larger whole. It's important. And we have to understand that they say like, trust needs to be understood in the context of love. Collaboration needs to be understood in the context of differentiation. Like all these different elements are balanced in a larger, fully integrated whole. Well, a largely fully integrated whole of all the distinct principles that our hearts have been pointing to and that are actually the constitutive elements of this thing we're talking about, that thing, God. I can go the other direction. And I can go from reverse engineering to forward engineering. Which historically has always been calling us forth. If I go back all the way back into history, deep history, let's go to the Bronze Age, and I notice these moments, these eras of, let's say, revelation or discovery, where new levels of wisdom and virtue pop through. And we can take Socrates for the moment, or Buddha, if we'd like. Um, and each one of these stages is a disclosure. Right? There's a vector to this. And many people are talking about this now from different fields of discovering that there's something like it's not the perennial philosophy. It's something deeper than that. It's a discovery of the ontological reality of reality through our sort of eyes closed exploration, our hard earned exploration. But when somebody flips over and says, "Oh yeah, courage, that's a virtue," and then people all over the place say, "Yeah, yeah, courage is a virtue. Honesty, that's a virtue. Um, Truthfulness, that's a virtue." As we keep disclosing these, what's happening is we're becoming more and more capable of actually seeing this thing. If we point that arrow in that direction towards the infinite, we can get on the journey of becoming more virtuous in ourselves, including, by the way, more humble in ourselves, and more capable of entering into virtuous relationships and virtuous friendships with other people, and more capacity to explore the space more and more completely. And we notice the 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 tunnel that we're on becoming a narrower and narrower point ending in something off towards infinity. That's God. All right. So both reverse engineering and forward engineering, and I'm using those tools, that language particularly to speak to a certain kind of mind. Um, yeah, if this notion could land on the heart of humanity in such a way that it was simply obvious, then that would be that.
Wow, I didn't expect that. I guess that somehow ties into the ideas of religion that's not a religion. Um,
Oh yes, yes, absolutely. Um, yes, yeah. This that question of the religion, or let's say the question of religion and spirituality, which became my primary focus probably 3 or 4 years ago, has been a beautiful journey. And by the way, a beautiful journey of this again, this continuous humiliation, which is to say, becoming humbled, becoming capable of humility, and noticing, right, from the arrogance of the secular and the arrogance of the materialist. Yeah, it turns out this wasn't thousands of years of people being stupid. It actually was the vast majority of humanity for the vast majority of our existence was actually onto something and have done a tremendous amount of incredible work. And if we actually just pay close attention and are able to separate the wheat from the chaff, right? Separate the things that happen when people are truly captured by the scarcity mindset, and truly captured by nihilism, right? By the nothing that pretends, that simulates to be something. Um, and though their words may be the words that others use, they are not true those words. And though their institutions may have names on them, they're not true those institutions. But the other side is true, that those who have been called forth by the abundance mindset, those whose hearts have had God land on them, have been pointing us in the proper way and have done incredibly good work for a very long time. And so let's take that humble pill seriously. So that's what I have to say.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that rich conversation. I'm sure, just like I feel, our listeners will have to digest that for a while. And yeah, maybe one day we can do a follow up and build on the things we discussed today. Thank you so much.
I certainly enjoyed it, and I feel like the way that you're showing up here has a quality that is just right at this moment. So I look forward to more.